All of them have been in mainstream and independent publishing for adults and children as writers and authors, editors, publishers, literary agents, teachers, and booksellers. So we have a power-packed, exciting panel to share their experiences and of independent publishing in Australia. May I say a few words about why independent publishing has become so important in a festival like this? Well, independent publishing is growing worldwide, and in the United States, a 216 report by the Association of American Publishers showed that the share of self-publishing books and books published by small publishers was at 42%, which was larger than the market share of big publishers, which is 34%. And in the UK, the latest figures from Impress, which works with 60 of the smallest players in the books industries, reveal sales up to 79% in the last year. And, which the managing director of Impress says is it puts down to a mix of really good books and a great attention to detail. And for Australia, of course, Sam has been sort of putting me on to some figures, but I couldn't, of course, get the sort of stats for that. But, going by the literary awards, like the 217 Prime Minister's Literary Awards in Australia, 19 of the 20 nominated books for adults were produced by this sector. I think that says a lot. That says a lot. And there was only one book which was published by Hachette, and that was a third novel of Stephen Anderson, and the first two novels had been published by small presses. So, and the nominees for the 4 other novels for the Fiction Prize, for the Poetry Prize, for the Non-Fiction category, and the Australian History category were all from small Australian publishers. In India, of course, I like to switch to the Indian situation. It has the second largest English publishing market after the US. Quality indie publishing, English language publishing picked up after 2000, especially in children's publishing. We have, Tulika Books, Tara Books, and Karadi Tales, and academic publishing, which has been around, Permanent Black, which has been around since 2000, and feminist publishing, of course, and poetry. So in the last 5 years, what is even more interesting, these were sort of specific, I would say specific interest publishing. But what is interesting, in the last 5 years, we've seen smaller publishing houses and imprints set up by former publishers. And as it turns out, all of them are from Penguin, India. We have Aleph Books by David Davida, who actually set up English language publishing in India. Then we have Speaking Tiger by Ravi Singh, who was, who worked under the banyan tree of David Davida, but now decided it was time he moved on. And recently, we've had Chiki Sarkar, who set up Juggernaut, which is really, on the forefront of e-publishing and digital publishing, and of course, print publishing. She does all of that. And all of these are general interest publishers. So, I think we are, well set to believe that indie publishing, there's a lot, the future could be indie publishing for the cutting edge work and, the really innovative kind of work. And without much ado, I'll go straight to the question, what is this beast called indie publishing? It seems to have many avatars. Sam, will you set the ball rolling, please?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations about what indie publishing and the word indie might mean. I guess, in my understanding, in Australian publishing, independent publishing is when a press is independent of a global multi-conglomerate maybe, or maybe separate from an institution, although then there's caveats on that, because you can be independent inside an institution or not. I guess it's not having strings, too many strings above you, or too many levels above you, I suppose, that govern you. And then, but I guess also independent publishing can be defined by the spirit of publishing as well, the whys of what you're putting out, but then we're getting down a whole rabbit hole there, I suppose. So for Live to Brow, we're a quarterly print journal for 10 years, and in the last couple of years I've expanded into book publishing because we saw a lack of a certain type of writing and writers perspectives and viewpoints in book publishing in Australia. Australia has lots of small presses, probably too many books being published in Australia, which I'm not sure if you're allowed to say that or not, but if you walk into a bookstore in Australia, there's lots of books and they don't get much of a shelf life a lot of the time. What we didn't want to be doing was putting more books out into the market for the sake of putting books, but we saw that there was certain writers and writing that perhaps wasn't being represented. And for writers in Australia, if you're not publishing books, you can hit a ceiling as far as your career. And so we sort of moved to that space, and we're an independent press. We have an office at a university, but no kind of controlling interest there. And we look to not disrupt, because I don't like that word, but to just to enhance and to demonstrate to maybe the big publishers in Australia that there are certain types of writing and writers that have an audience that are of interest to readers, and that not that the word deserve is the right word, but that have earned the right to be platformed in a way that we are hoping to do and are learning to do in book publishing, which is a new field. So.
Would Terry Ann, we can go around the table, and then Margaret will do children's publishing. We'll come back to you for children's publishing. Yeah.
Thank you, Kamini. I mean, one of the things for me about independent publishing is, and as an independent publisher, I'm wanting to make books that will still be around in 50 years' time, whether they're in print or not, but they'll be in the consciousness of the culture that I live in. So that's about not making a commodity. And so that's the simple difference, that we're controlled globally by a big $6 billion multinational company structure, and then all of the independents, whether they publish one book in their lifetime or one book a year or 100 books, sit under that and I suppose are contributing to something that's going to last for longer than that shelf life. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I'm wanting to make books that will stick around and have an impact on the culture that I live in.
What about you, Claire? Claire, would you like?
So I'm not really a publisher. I'm an author. But my career has now crossed from traditional publishing. So my first book was traditionally published. That's set in Tibet. My second book, The Pagoda Tree, was first published traditionally in Australia, but then in the UK it was published by a company called Unbound. So Unbound is both a traditional publisher and a crowdfunding platform. And what's really interesting about Unbound is it actually uses a model from the 18th century, and it now is very much driven by 21st century digital programs. So when a writer like Voltaire couldn't get his book published in Paris, he went to the UK and he rode around in a carriage trying to get supporters to publish his book. And eventually he did. And this publishing was known as subscription publishing. And many other publishers at that time used it. So basically, a bunch of people support a writer to write their book. And that's what Unbound does now for writers. And I think what's really interesting about that form of independent publishing is that it's about the community. And certainly for myself as an author, I think the way forward for authors is to build a really solid community of readers. And what traditional publishing doesn't do is that, because when your book gets published, the publisher has no idea who your readers are. Whereas, this Unbound was actually started by 3 authors who were fed up with the publishing models that were in existence, and they realised that they needed to create that community. So I think independent publishing is now taking on many different forms, and it's organisations like Unbound, what Terry Ann's talking about, and Sam and Margreta. What they're trying to do is trying to take risks with books, and so often with the big publishers they don't take risks. They choose 2 or 3 authors that are going to be the celebrity authors, that they're going to put a lot of money behind, and the rest of the authors, the mid-list authors, don't get that same traction, or they don't get the shelf life. So I think independent publishing is very exciting, and I'll leave it at that. But I'd love to talk more about the self-publishing, which is the sort of the next stage of that. Thank you.
Would you like to talk about the children's? Marguerite, by the way, has been the publisher for a long time for Australia's biggest independent publishing for children. And she's a sort of internationally renowned children's illustrator, as well as, of course, she's now. Tell us a bit about Dirt Press and why you.
Just in terms of what is this beast called independent publishing, I initially worked for Scholastic, which obviously isn't an independent, and then moved to a very small family-run company called Little Hare, who was then bought by another company called Hardy Grant. And Hardy Grant also called itself an independent publisher, but it was a very, very commercial, mainstream publisher. So in terms of its ethos, the ethos was to be mainstream, to be like a mainstream publisher, and they had all the same sort of imperatives as a mainstream publisher. So I left there just a couple of months ago, and have gone the absolute opposite extreme to another kind of independent publisher, which has got a strong niche. Now, what's the word that you don't like to use?
There's lots of words I don't like to use, but which one?
Oh, something about being disruptive.
Yeah.
We want to be disruptive. But in a very, in the nicest possible way, of course. One of the reasons that I needed to leave my previous job was the idea that there is no future for literary picture books. Now, I'm primarily a picture book publisher, and art direction and illustration are my main love. But in the previous session, they were talking about, do we leave spaces for the readers to kind of interpret from the books? And in a way, leaving a space in a text is a literary thing to do. And leaving a space in picture books in mainstream publishing is now not an accepted thing. It all has to be very clear and very black and white. But I believe, and the people in my team believe, that we do need to leave spaces. There needs to be ambiguity, and there needs to be a little bit of sort of disruption of normal thinking patterns for readers to open up ways of thinking. And so we, what our aim is to publish books usually by well-known authors who are feeling constrained by the constraints of current commercial publishing and are unable to stretch or extend or explore or experiment. And so we're accepting stories from people who have feeling that their wings have been clipped, or that their careers have come to an end because they can't work in a broader sense. And that goes for authors and also for illustrators. So we're an independent, and where I worked before was an independent, but I think that we're on opposite ends of the independent spectrum.
So that's really fantastic, because that gives us a whole idea of the range of possibilities which an author has, and sort of to plug themselves. But I'm curious to know, around the table again, how do you find and choose the books you publish? I mean, Marguerite has sort of hinted at that, but starting with you, Sam, and going around the table.
I think small presses, generally independent and small presses, especially, and again, I'm speaking to Australia, which is what I know, are much closer to the community of writers that are out there and authors, just by dint of often they're writers themselves, but they're the editors of these small presses are often the ones turning up to events, appearing on panels a lot of the time, often due to the fact that at big presses, the editors are just so pressed for time, and they're every year are having to put more books out with less resources, that and it's one of the big shames, I think, that in the commercialisation, the uber commercialisation of publishing, like all industry, that that you don't see editors kind of carousing around as much anymore from the big presses with the grassroots of writing, and you don't see them turning up to reading nights or that kind of thing. And it's a shame. And so they try to fill that space by running manuscript prizes and things like this. But so for us, most of the titles that we have or will publish have come through seeing an author reading a piece of theirs in a journal, or some kind of organic pathway. We also open for submissions, and we're putting a novel out in March that's from a 20-year-old Melburnian writer who just came through the first batch of submissions we ever opened, where there was 47 manuscripts that were automatic no, and one that was it was a yes because it was so obviously different to the rest, and then it was a definite yes after a couple of reads. So yeah, that kind of organic discovery, I suppose.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's how Indian publishing has been working. Even for the mainstream publishers, we don't have literary agents, or very few, or they hardly operate as such. And in a way, our mainstream publishing actually sources in the same way as you.
Well, I'm sure Kelly can talk
can talk about this. Please tell us, Kelly. Yeah, what's the sort of what about the literary agent in small publishing?
Well, so I was an editor before I started the agency, and I did begin my career it was at one point an independent press, like many of the presses were. Penguin was an independent press. Little Brown Charles was an independent press, wasn't it? And so I worked for Weidenfeld and Nicholson, which was an independent press, who took a risk with publishing Lolita, many years ago. And but as a literary agent, I love the independent presses, especially now because they're paying a little bit more money. No pressure, Sam, on it. But I feel that I really love working with independent presses. I submit to them regularly, and at the same time as I submit to the big four now, and I find that the small publishers, even if they end up paying less, they have a greater stake in the project. So there's a lot more energy behind the project. There's a lot more collaboration, behind what happens with the book, and they're more responsive to emails. You're not just one, cog in this huge wheel, and so they are more interested in helping to build the careers of their authors that they take, a stake in, because they understand the difficulties of trying to get this author out there against the competition from the big four and all the money that the big four. So I think with the independent presses, you have a lot of you have success in part because of the dynamic energy that goes into the creation of the work and the afterward, after the book is published, the publicity, the marketing, etc. Yeah.
Can I just add
Yes,
to
yes,
that?
of course.
So I don't publish a book unless I love it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in the last 5 years or so, there have been many authors who I love who have...
Publishers have a lot to offer authors, and I think it's all of what both Sam and Terry Ann have been saying. It's that sense of if you work with an editor who wants to build your career, that's the way an author really lasts. And you might not write your breakout book until your third book, your fourth book, your fifth book. I mean, it's often not your first book, your first novel that's going to be the one that gets reviewed. And if you're expected to sell 40 or 50,000 copies, and 90 to 95% of the budgeting, the budget goes on 2 to 3 big name authors, which is what happens in the big publishers, it's really hard to make it. So I would always encourage writers to approach the smaller presses and try and find an editor and an agent, if they're looking for an agent, who really gets them. Because that's what you want as a writer. You want to be understood, and some editors just get what you're trying to say and help you improve it, which is also what you want from an editor. You don't just want to be a cog in a very big machine, and small presses will often do that. They have the time, they have the passion. I think passion, vocation and passion is what keeps us here.
Now, to come back to the problems of sort of marketing promotion, what do you think is the role of the authors then? How does it work in Australia? I mean, with the small presses, do the authors, are they called upon to do a lot for them, or do their editors or their publishers do that? How do you go about marketing and promoting your books?
Shall I?
Please, Margaret.
It's a vexed question to start off with, and there is a clause in most contracts that say, you know, the author or the illustrator will make themselves available, you know, to promote the book. I think a number of authors and illustrators do want the company to do the work, and I think when it's a big company, they expect a lot of marketing dollar, and are generally disappointed when there isn't any, because there generally isn't. In a larger company, you know, the publicity and marketing department have got their small budget. They decide well in advance whether this book deserves money or not, and deserves a push or not, and it's only available around release time. And so anyone who's missed the marketing or publicity of this book, you know, in the public, won't get it a month later, because already the budget's been spent and there's no more that's going to be spent on it. And but what we have found is that when people have this thing called passion and are writers or illustrators with a vocation, they actually do get out and do the work. The sad thing is that that these authors, like we've got one who self-funds world tours as well as Australia-wide tours to do readings, and you know, she's been to Finland and to Moscow and Austria and Germany and all over the place promoting this book. And of course we're doing, I'm talking about my previous employer, reprint after reprint, of which she of course only gets 5%, because she's sharing it with the illustrator. So she was quite vexed with this, but the fact is that there isn't enough woman power in publishing to do that kind of promotion for every author, and there certainly isn't enough money to do that kind of promotion. And so it's wonderful when somebody self-promotes. We call them TSPs, which means tireless self-promoters, and everybody loves a TSP. I haven't got the answer. You know, after 20 years in trade publishing, I don't know what the answer is. I don't have a fair answer. The excellent answer is that the creators work hard at promoting. I knew one person who, 20 years ago, was making $100,000 a year from being a writer, but 50,000 of that was from going around to schools, giving talks and presentations and workshops. So he actually funded himself by not being at his desk writing, but being out there teaching and doing readings.
Would you like to?
I was just saying, like, it's contextual every single time because every single author is different, and the worst thing you can do to an author is put them in a situation where they're not comfortable or natural and chuck them on a social media platform or put them on a stage in a situation which isn't right. But I think the best marketing promotion is a beautiful marriage between what a publisher can offer, which is those kind of traditional well-worn pathways to newspaper reviews and other kinds of reviews, sending out copies, connections with journalists and trying to get a profile or finding the angle on the stories, and then the author steps in and does that more organic community-based thing, but it's always contextual because an author's community is always about who they are and what they've written about. Just to go back on what Claire was saying as well earlier about a small publisher being someone who's maybe more loyal and passionate, like that happened a couple of times with us in my very early career as a publisher in the last couple of years. We've had our very first book we put out, we organised to publish, or I spoke to the author for a long time, and then at the very last minute another publisher came along, heard about it and offered this author a deal. I'm in a very established press, not one of the big ones, but a very established Australian press, and I had a bit of a crisis of confidence for a couple of weeks, thinking that I didn't want to wheel and deal and negotiate for this book if the actual other publisher could do a better job. But what the case was, this publisher had actually rejected the book 3 times before, and then now had found out that it was something a bit better, and we'd worked on it and had tried to come in. And I know this author very well, and her career is something that I'm hugely interested in, and she's now a friend. And I had to talk to her a lot to lay it out and say, I don't want to get in the way of what could be a career-defining thing for you. It wasn't a giant deal or anything, but it was an established publisher, and we weren't. And but by the end of that 2 weeks of kind of self-reflection and talking with friends and people in the industry, I realised that we were going to do a better job with that book. We knew that book, back to front. We knew her. We knew where the readers were. We knew how to talk to them. We knew how to describe the book. All these small things which made the book what it was, and it made it a success. And I still believe, you never know, but that we sold many more copies than that publisher would have. That publisher would have got maybe the 2 weeks of promotion and marketing that was allocated for that month, and then would have probably been dropped if it hadn't made a striking success. And then another one, we've just had an author come across from a big publisher in Australia who called me up in November last year and said, listen, I want to leave. I just don't feel like they understand the book. It's a difficult kind of 5-part non-fiction genre blending book. And she said, they have lots of money. They have all these people who keep emailing me who I don't know saying, this is what we're going to do, but they don't get it. And I feel like, you don't have to give me any advance or anything like that. But, we're going to do this together. And it was, music to my ears. But that book's coming out in May this year, and I'm so excited. But that's what I think a small press can do, is that one-on-one relationship with an author and ultimately do a better job for the book.
I mean, the independent presses are filling the gap. I mean, because of corporatization of publishing, they've made they're trying to, the corporate bosses are imposing, targets each year, profit targets, right? So in order to sometimes hit those targets, they're cutting staff. That's the easiest way to, increase your money coming in. And so you've got one editor doing the job of, 3 editors nowadays, where one editor could take his or her time with a book and help it develop and help it grow. And I remember when, Weidenfeld was bought by, it was part of Orion when I was working there, but then it became part of Hachette. And one of the first years when Hachette took us over, our CEO gave us a talk and said, okay, we only want you now to commission bestsellers. As if, we always only wanted to commission bestsellers, but it meant that we were here talking about a couple of people mentioned the mid-list. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it is this list of authors who don't, immediately, hit gold, or hit pay dirt in the first 1 or 2 or 3 novels, but they have steady sales. And then eventually the hope is that as you help them develop their career, then they, come out with their life-changing novel. I mean, Ian Rankin didn't publish his life-changing novel until book 8. And he was a mid-list author, until then. So what the independent presses are doing, they're taking up the kind of that space that the big publishers can no longer afford to do because they don't have the time, and they have too much pressure from the CEOs in France or wherever to make more money off of fewer books.
On the profit and loss balance sheet, that large publishers need to sell a lot of copies just to break even. I can pitch much lower and actually cover costs and make a reasonable go of it with a much smaller sales result. One of the things that I wanted to say about the marketing was simply that we're working really hard these days with social media and with the whole range of online opportunities to find the communities of interest for our books that are not mainstream, but they do have clusters of people who are going to be interested. And there are ways that are kind of a new form of direct marketing, of targeting, direct sales from, for instance, all of the architecture firms in Australia to actually come up with a result that means we have to do a reprint after 4 weeks of a $65 book. And that kind of activity is really productive and really wonderful. The flip side to that is, and I'm sure everyone in the audience has seen when authors go too far on social media with self-promotion and you switch off and you unfriend them or you stop paying attention because it's complete overkill. And so that's the thing that we need to make sure that authors don't overdo it, because it looks terrible. It really looks terrible. And I'm sure all of us have had that experience.
My advice to those authors has always been, if you're not enjoying social media, get off it. Like, you're better off not coming up on a Google search for your awful Twitter account that looks like a robot's doing it, then like maintain an air of mystery than actually have that footprint, you know, I think.
So that's interesting though, because as an author, one of the first things that a publisher will do or an agent will do is do your clout count. Does everybody know what a clout count is?
I can't believe clout's still around.
It is still around. So clout is basically you put in somebody's number of Facebook followers, Twitter followers into clout, and then they get a rating.
It's like a Black Mirror episode,
Yeah,
isn't it?
and so agents will do that. Agents in the UK, I know, do that. In the States, they do that. Do you do that, Kelly?
I haven't ever used Clout, but I always ask my authors, who do you know? Please list them, or I know who they are before I, take them on. And it's important, because the publishers will ask that. And I have some authors who come to me who say, I don't want to make any money. I'm like, but I do. So I'm terrible at self-promotion. And I'm like, you're really not selling yourself to me. How am I going to sell you to a publisher? And I always tell my authors to be shameless about self-promotion. But I take your point about it. That it can become a bit too much. And I'm terrible at social media. And one of my authors, who's Indian, he says to me, Kelly, I can always tell when you're tweeting because you always go, yay, and then you say something. I just have no idea how to do it. But so I'm going to say that from now on, that I'm maintaining an air of mystery with my social media. I think it is important, because these are your primary readers, aren't they? The people that you know, and through them you're going to reach a wider audience. And it is important to cultivate, your friends and followers. Absolutely.
Can I add on to that? Sorry, just to extend what you're saying, and also what you said, Terry Ann, about developing a new sort of audience or group of people. I found my mother always used to say to me, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. And applying that to sort of marketing. We're always complaining that sales are shrinking, but the actual marketing system hasn't really changed. We're still doing traditional marketing, advertising in literary reviews, and but finding that we're not selling books. But there are people out there who will never ever read a review or a literary journal, but who will read a book, who will never go into a bookshop, but who will read a book. If it applies to them. And so one of the things that we're doing at Dirt Lane Press is, with each book, we're thinking, where is the audience for this outside of bookshops or literary review magazines? And so I'll just talk about one in particular. The title of the book is The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness, which in itself is a really powerful title. But what the story is about, it's the author he's an exemplary illustrator, and he's also an awarded composer, and he's also a flamenco guitarist. But on top of that, he has bipolar disorder and often gets very, very ill. Usually with the depression, but when he goes on a high, he does crazy things like goes to Somalia. But but anyway, he's this wonderful, talented person. So what we're doing is we're partnering with the local hospital. I live in a region. The publishing company is in this region that's got a very good art community, so we're going to the regional hospital and the mental health facility, and we're going to the conservatorium where they will be able to play the music that he's composed to go with this book, and we've gone to the regional art gallery where they will hold an exhibition in one of their main gallery spaces. So without going to any literary journal or advertising in the normal channels, we're going to be accessing this huge, the music community and the mental health community and the art community, and putting the book out in front of all those people who might not otherwise be alerted to the existence of the book. And I think that is probably going to be our model going forward. We're doing another book also, which is called The Dream Peddler, which actually is about ice addiction, which is a huge problem in Australia and I think around the world. I'm not sure what the problem is like here, but we've taken all the ice out, so it's just a fable, but we can go to mental health facilities and drug rehabilitation facilities and youth facilities and talk about this book and put it out there for them to discuss, and leave spaces open for them to work out for themselves. So that is a way of taking books out in a non-traditional way.
And that's really sort of specific targeting and building your own communities. It seems very, very exciting, in fact. I'm afraid we're sort of kind of running out of time, so I think, well, we'd like to talk about the challenges now. So how good has indie publishing been for authors? Of course, Claire has given us some sense of that, but can we just quickly go around the thing?
I think it creates a diversity of options for authors, small presses. I think, provide a potential home that isn't, lumping a bunch of different varieties of authors under one big umbrella, under one company, but saying, there is maybe a publishing house with a bunch of people who are tuned into exactly what you want to talk about, are interested in making meaning, not money, like culture, not commerce, is what we often say at the Brow. But I think it's important just to say as well that I love big publishing a lot of the time. I love reading some pulpy things. I love reading some of the big authors that are publishing houses, and I have some really great friends who work at big publishing houses. So it's definitely not like a us versus them dynamic. And also just to say that there are some books that have an ideal readership number, and that the success isn't based on the sales. It's there are some books in Australia that are, a book of poetry where, unless it happens to strike some kind of pure luck or fortune or something, that maybe the ideal amount of sales for that are the potential is 700 copies or something, and that might be the absolute success for that book. And I think it's important for authors and for editors and publishers to be communicating that to authors, that there are some books, not just poetry books, but novels or non-fiction books or anything in between, that you could throw $100,000 of marketing at it and it probably wouldn't lift sales a huge amount, because that book isn't supposed to be a bestseller. And that's important to know each book and each author's reach, and that you're not a failure because you sold less copies than somebody else.
So I wasn't trying to bag the big publishers, but they have set these benchmarks of bestsellers. I of course have a book in my bag, but a book that the author, to say what do authors get from independent publishing. This is a first-time author. It's a book of short stories. It's a cover design. The image came from the author, and it probably wouldn't have been published by very many other people. It's won one award so far and been highly commended for another. What the author gets is the confidence of we do the best that we can for the period of its life that we hope to extend. So we get it into the hands of the right people. We give the support editorially and beyond, and I think we start to build that community of great creativity.
Yeah, that sounds
Can I just add that I think what hasn't been touched on so far is the fact that indie publishing also has a very different definition now, and that is it's also known as self-publishing. And for authors who can't get traditionally published, I think self-publishing really has a lot going for it. The experience with Unbound and the Pagoda Tree forced me out of my comfort zone because I had to crowdfund, which meant I had to put myself out there on social media, improve my clout, etc. And it meant that my third book, which is a co-authored memoir with my mum, we actually didn't even take it to a traditional publisher. We published it ourselves. We did the whole process ourselves. I put together my own publishing imprint, and it's now on Amazon. And I noticed that at the festival there's a KDP Amazon stand, and certainly in India, Amazon India, which was launched in 2012, is really going to start taking off. There are 730 million mobile phone users in India, a number that's only going to increase. And the fact is, people are reading more and more. They might not be reading books, but they're reading on their phones, they're reading digitally. And indie publishing, when it's talked about in terms of self-publishing, you can make a lot of money. You can take on a project that a traditional publisher won't touch, whether it's a small press or a big press. And I really encourage people who come to my workshops to look at all options, because I don't think there has ever been a better time to be a writer than now. I mean, we have communities through social media. We can do things that 10, 20 years ago writers couldn't do.
Absolutely, I think that's really sort of democratization for the writers and for publishers too. And can we wind up by talking about new formats of indie publishing? Audiobooks, live streaming. Is there anything to be said about that? So okay, and so yeah, maybe we'll open it up to questions. Yes, please.
Now we can have questions now.
Yeah, let's have a round of questions, please. Running short of time. Maybe we won't. No, I think we are sort of running short of time, and we'd like to open the.
But I think the question is, what other formats are there? Is that your question, sir? So I think that's the other thing. As for our authors, the way to be empowered is to look at your IP. And the fact is, a book is just one medium. You can publish that book through audio. You can, if you're careful with how you sell your rights, you can do so many more things with books. And a lot of authors don't realize that. So I think the opportunities, again, are just increasing hugely through digital and through non-digital means.
May I ask the first question? I have the mic. Sorry. Yeah. So my question is addressed to the publishers and the literary agent. And also to just say that, when the introduction was given, I think it was on independent publishing in India, it was very English specific. And there is a very huge, thriving independent publishing scene in the language. And right now, at the moment, the Chennai Book Fair is going on. And there are actually thousands of independent language publishers all over India. And my question to the publishers and the literary agent is if you've looked at all at the language market in India, and do you have an interest in it?
One of my authors has just had his book commissioned to be translated into Hindi by Oxford University Press, and we're very excited about that because the book is called River of Life, River of Death, the Ganges and India's Future. So we expect to sell hundreds of thousands of copies of this book in Hindi. And no, I'm really excited about that. And absolutely, I would love for all, it's a real feather in the cap of my authors to have their book translated into various languages. And, we're very aware that sometimes there's no money in the pot to pay the authors much, but it's the feather in the cap, and also the problem though is in India at the moment is that how many good translators do you have, and how can you pay them well enough? So that's a little bit. I would love for my authors to be translated into all the various languages in India. Absolutely, yeah.
I think that's part of. The exciting thing about this trip is to open up to whole new markets, because we tend to be very Eurocentric and United States centric when we go to the book fairs and to try to sell into those markets. But there are these other huge markets, the Indian market and the Chinese market. My concern, when I was the books that I've brought with me for this tour. Is to what extent that that they have an interest for different communities and different languages here, because as humans, we have very shared experience, but the way in which we couch that experience might not resonate. And so what I'm very interested in while we're here meeting publishers is asking, what element of the stories that I've brought will resonate with your audience, and how might we be able to couch these stories differently in order to resonate, because it's a very exciting market, I think.
I'm very interested.
My question is to the author. My question is a two-part. Can I?
I'll just quickly finish to Mary. I'm very interested in all of the other languages that I've had one book translated from Hindi, but I would love to be able to send some of my books to India for translation, and I'm particularly interested in the whole. I mean, as a serious monolingual, poor creature, to be able to get a sense of how to understand the richness of the language world of India, and to be able to enter into some of that writing.
But as you say, it's beyond India, and unfortunately, though, going into translation, often the Chinese publishers or the Asian publishers or French or any other language, they often want the seal of approval of an English language deal before they'll look at a book. I hate that's how it is, but I have my Chinese sub-agents say to me, if I have a deal in UK for a certain book, they'll say, well, who's your USA publisher? And I'm like, isn't the UK enough? It's in English by a very prestigious publisher. What more do you need? And they say, well, we need a USA publisher, the extra seal of approval. But also the money that comes in is very important from China and other countries can, double, treble, make the advance money, exponentially greater than the initial advance from English language. So it's all, dollars and cents. And so that's another reason why it's very important for me to, have these deals in foreign languages.
This question is to the author. It's a two-part question. Well, as an author, you said self-publishing, you can also make money. Sort of, is it synonymous with independent publishing in a way? And I would like to know, how can you make money as a self-published author? And what about the book launches? Do you believe in book launches, and does that improve your marketing?
Okay, I'll try and answer quickly. I just also want to say to Mary's question that Amazon India now publish in 5 languages in India. So there are options for that for self-publishers. So self-publishing is essentially where you are the author and the publisher. The best way to get your book out there is through Amazon at the moment, but there are many other platforms, and you're welcome to talk to me afterwards about that. How do you make money? You basically, if you sell through Amazon exclusively, the author gets 70% of royalties. And you either go just digitally, or you do what's known as print on demand, where somebody in Brazil can click on your book icon on Amazon, and Amazon will print it there, and then they'll just print one copy and send it to the buyer. Do book launches work? I love book launches, and I think it's a celebration for the author and all the people who've put up with the author during the writing of the book. Do they make money? Not a huge amount, but they're fun. They can do, and it's a celebration.
I belong to the second category.
Okay, enjoy.
I've written about 9 books. The launches give a lot of satisfaction, and a name to you.
Thank you for all the insights. Have you seen any interesting reaction from the so-called traditional publishers to this self-publishing movement? And if there has been an interesting, when I say interesting, more from the point of view of getting it out there, which might be the publishers you've seen take those steps in a way which is complementary to the independent publishers?
And I am and are sometimes between whether I would like the big publishers to change and to do better and to be closer to what we do sometimes, or whether I want them to stay away and let us do what we want to do and leave us alone and don't interfere. But you see these publishers, if a book does well at a small press, a book that is maybe a difficult book or provocative, controversial, or just in some way literary or poetic or anything that maybe a big publisher has or would have declined to work with that book or that author, they'll come sniffing around as soon as that author it does well. If there's money to be made, but also prestige to be had, then they'll come along with that, that bag of money, so to say, and say, listen, and that's actually a challenge that all independent publishers have to then deal with. Whether do you fight for that author, and generally you do, but how far are you willing to fight, and are you willing, obviously you don't have the money a lot of the time to spend, but do you convince that author to stay with you for less money when they could be making, a proper career or a full-time job out of that work? And that's, I think, something case by case. You have to have that conversation with yourself and with the author. But yes, you do see publishers reacting in different ways. Yeah.
Can I just very quickly? So I had our first best-selling experience last year. We won the major, most prestigious literary award in Australia, and they're right, the sales flow. The author, I published her first book 12 years ago, and her second book at the end of 2016, the second novel that won 2 awards. And she couldn't get an agent. She'd been disappointed with the result of her first, the sales result of her first novel, and so she'd sniffed around a little bit for a publisher through, and an agent, and been knocked back on most cases, because it was a literary novel that had pictures in it. It was a Sebaldian style novel. The book won the award. Within 6 hours, I had about 50 requests to read the novel from all of the international publishers I love. I've sold it to the UK and the US, and I've had to do all of that work because there wasn't an agent there. It's a really exciting moment. I haven't really heard of any, I haven't heard from the author that anyone's kind of approached her yet, but I expect that will be the case when there's a third novel. And I'm hoping that she'll stay with me, but again, I want the best from the author, actually. And we've had this huge windfall this year. And so I'm just showing myself up as a generous type.
And thank you very much, Sam, Marguerite, Kelly, Claire, and Terry Ann. That was great fun. Thank you.